The mess hall was always the busiest place on the ship. It was where everyone gathered, no matter their rank or role, and the result was a constant stream of clattering trays, the scrape of chairs, and the hum of voices overlapping one another. The smell of food hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of the ship itself. For many, it was a break from duty, but for the cubs, the youngest trainees, it was a test of patience and discipline. The officers who managed the hall cared deeply about order. Everything had to be done properly. Cups were stacked neatly, trays returned in the right place, and no one was to waste time shuffling around. Rules were strict, and so was the watchful eye of the mess officer. He believed discipline in small things carried over into larger ones, and so he was sharp about even the smallest mistake. The cubs, however, were still learning. They were quick, energetic, and eager to help, but they often tripped over their own enthusiasm. Carrying a stack of cups, one would accidentally drop one, sending it rolling noisily across the floor. Another would stack them by hand but mix the sizes so badly that none fit together properly. Sometimes, in their rush, they would set cups down without shining them, leaving smudges or fingerprints behind. The officer's voice would cut through the hall whenever that happened, his sharp tone echoing louder than the trays. To the older crew, these mistakes were minor. But to the cubs, each error felt like a heavy weight. Their hands fumbled, their eyes darted nervously, and their ears burned when the officer scolded them. Still, they tried. They wanted to fit in with the seasoned crew, to show they could handle even the smallest tasks. In the middle of all this, the mess hall kept moving. The line for food snaked forward, crew members laughed with one another, and utensils clinked against metal plates. Yet the cubs' struggle stood out. Their small figures moved quickly between tables, balancing cups and trays with the awkward seriousness of those trying too hard. Sometimes, when two cubs tried to fix the same mistake at once, they bumped into each other, nearly dropping everything again. The officers demanded order because they believed chaos in the mess meant chaos elsewhere. For them, the mess hall was not just about food. It was a place where discipline showed itself. And so, when they saw the cubs fumbling, their patience wore thin. Still, the cubs never stopped trying. Even under the officer's sharp gaze, they picked up fallen cups, restacked them, and polished them again. Their faces carried the same mix of embarrassment and determination. They might have been young, but deep inside, they wanted to prove themselves. That was the routine of the mess hall, the noise, the rules, the constant corrections, and the cubs learning in small, stumbling steps. No one yet realized that soon, in this same space, those very cubs would show a kind of order no command could demand, an order born not from discipline alone, but from respect. The mess hall buzzed with its usual energy. But on that particular day, the noise carried a sharper edge. Trays clattered, spoons tapped, and voices overlapped, but cutting through it all was the commanding bark of the mess officer. His voice was firm, echoing across the walls, and every cub in the hall froze where they stood. "Keep it neat," he ordered, pointing sharply at the row of cups near the counter. The cubs glanced at one another nervously. Their earlier rush to finish had left the stack in a sorry state. Some cups leaned sideways, others were stacked out of order, and the dull shine of fingerprints was clear even from a distance. The officer's irritation was not just about the cups, it was about what they represented. In his eyes, sloppy cups meant sloppy thinking, and sloppy thinking on a vessel could mean mistakes with far greater consequences. He demanded precision not because he wanted perfection for its own sake, but because he believed discipline in the smallest of tasks shaped discipline in the hardest of challenges. Still, to the cubs, his scolding felt heavy and personal. One of the cubs picked up a cup to fix it, but his hand shook, and the cup slipped, rattling loudly as it rolled across the floor. A few crew members chuckled under their breath. The sound burned in the cub's ears. Another cub quickly bent to pick it up, but in his hurry he stacked it on top of the wrong size again, making the line wobble dangerously. The officer's glare grew sharper, and his voice rose once more. "Order! Precision! This is not play!" he shouted. The cubs stood stiffly, their eyes wide, as if each word weighed them down further. Around the hall, the older crew fell quiet, sensing the tension building. The cubs scrambled to correct their mistake. They began polishing the cups with the ends of their sleeves, rubbing away the fingerprints, then carefully aligning them by size. Their small hands worked quickly but clumsily, and every small error earned them another sharp word from the officer. They weren't lazy. They were just inexperienced. One of the older crew members leaned to his neighbor and whispered, "They're just learning." But the officer was not in a mood for patience. To him, excuses had no place on the ship. As the cubs continued their work, the air in the mess hall thickened. It was no longer just the sound of utensils and chatter. It was the silence of everyone watching, waiting to see whether the cubs would crumble under the officer's harsh tone or rise to the challenge. The cubs could feel it too. Their faces flushed, their hearts raced, but beneath their embarrassment was a quiet determination. They wanted to get it right, not just to silence the officer's commands, but to show they belonged here, just as much as the older crew. What began as scattered cups and dull surfaces was slowly becoming more than a simple task. In that moment, without realizing it, the cubs were about to show the mess hall that even under pressure, even under sharp words, they could create order, not by fear alone, but by learning to move together. The officer's voice still echoed in the mess hall, sharp and commanding, but not everyone reacted the same way. Near the back of the room, a human technician sat quietly at his table, unaffected by the tension. He didn't join in the laughter when the cubs fumbled, nor did he look irritated at the noise. Instead, he focused on a single cup in front of him. With a folded napkin, he began to polish it in slow, steady circles. His movements were calm, unhurried, and almost rhythmic, as though the shouting around him didn't exist. The cup gradually changed under his hands. What had been dull and spotted with faint marks now began to gleam under the mess hall lights. The shine wasn't forced. It came from care, from the patience of someone who understood that even small tasks deserved attention. Once finished, the human placed the cup neatly on the table. There was no announcement, no display, no words at all. He simply continued with his meal as though this act of quiet precision was the most natural thing in the world. The cubs noticed. At first, it was just one of them, sneaking a glance toward the back, curious about the man who seemed untouched by the officer's scolding. Then another cub saw, then another, until most of them had their eyes drawn to him. It wasn't the cup itself that caught them. It was the way he worked. There was no panic in his hands, no fear of making mistakes, only quiet confidence. The officer hadn't noticed yet. He was still pacing near the counter, barking corrections, his frustration filling every corner of the room. But for the cubs, something shifted. They looked at their own stack of cups and then back at the shining one on the human's table. Without a word, they began imitating his method. One cub took a napkin, another began arranging the cups by size more carefully, and soon they were working slower, steadier, almost in unison. The difference showed quickly. The cups that had looked scattered and dull now began to line up neatly. Their surfaces reflected the light again, not perfectly, but enough that even the older crew began to murmur with approval. Still, the cubs weren't thinking about the officer anymore. They were focused on the example quietly set before them. The human didn't once glance at them, nor did he offer instructions. His patience was his teaching. In a hall filled with noise and command, his silence carried the loudest lesson. The cubs understood that discipline wasn't just about obeying orders. It was about choosing care over carelessness, calm over panic. By the time the officer turned back toward them, the scene had changed. The cups were aligned, polished, and organized. The cubs stood straighter, their nerves settling, not from fear, but from a new sense of control. The officer's eyes narrowed at first, suspicious of how quickly the mess had turned orderly, but then he noticed the gleaming row of cups and the quiet pride on the cubs' faces. What the officer hadn't seen, but the cubs never forgot, was that order could be inspired not by force, but by example. And in that moment, the quiet patience of one human spoke louder than all the shouting in the hall. At first, the cubs hesitated, unsure if they were doing the right thing. But the image of the human calmly polishing his cup stayed in their minds. Slowly, they bent down to collect the scattered cups, their clumsy hands moving with surprising care. One cub placed the largest cup at the bottom of the row, then another added a slightly smaller one beside it. The line began to take shape, growing longer as each cub followed the pattern. For the first time since the officer's harsh command, their movements carried purpose instead of fear. The mess hall, usually filled with clattering trays and loud chatter, grew strangely quiet. Even the sound of utensils striking plates seemed softer, as if everyone present was holding their breath to watch what would happen next. The cubs leaned closer to each other, whispering instructions without raising their voices. "This one goes here," a small voice murmured. Another cub nodded, sliding a dull, scratched cup near the end while keeping the shinier ones closer to the front. Each placement mattered to them now, because they had seen how a single polished cup could shine so brightly under the hall's lights. Soon, the scattered heap that had drawn the officer's anger transformed into an orderly line, cups aligned by size and gleam. The officer, standing a few steps away, noticed the change but did not immediately interrupt. His sharp eyes scanned the rows, and though his arms remained crossed, his tone softened slightly as he muttered something under his breath. To him, discipline meant obedience, but what he saw now was different. The cubs were not obeying because of his scolding. They were copying the patience of someone who hadn't spoken a word to them. The other crew members also began to notice. A few leaned over their trays to watch the neat arrangement taking shape. Some exchanged quiet smiles, surprised at how quickly the young ones had shifted from fumbling hands to steady teamwork. What had started as fear of punishment was slowly turning into pride, though none of the cubs dared admit it yet. Meanwhile, the human remained seated at his table, finishing his meal as though unaware of the influence he had created. The gleaming cup in front of him still caught the light, and each time the cubs looked at it, their hands grew steadier, their movements calmer. They did not rush anymore. They placed each cup carefully, almost as though the act itself carried meaning beyond cleaning. By the time the last cup was set in place, the line stretched across the table like a quiet symbol of order. The cubs stepped back, their small faces glowing with a mixture of relief and pride. They didn't laugh or boast, but the silence in the mess hall spoke louder than words. What had begun as scattered chaos was now harmony born from imitation. The lesson had not come from commands or threats, but from watching a human who showed that dignity could exist even in the smallest acts. The officer took a step forward, his voice already prepared to cut through the room like it always did, but the words caught in his throat. What he saw was not sloppy hands rushing to cover up mistakes, nor the usual nervous scrambling after being shouted at. Instead, the cubs moved with quiet precision, their small hands carefully holding each cup as though it were fragile crystal. One wiped the rim with the edge of a cloth, another polished the sides until a dull cup shone faintly, and another made sure the line stayed straight, adjusting every piece so the edges matched. The officer's stern eyes softened against his will. They weren't just tidying up anymore, they were creating order piece by piece, almost like a ritual. The human technician sat silently at his table, watching without a word, his own polished cup resting in front of him like a standard to follow. The cubs kept glancing at it as if drawing strength from its simple shine. When they finished with one, they would gently place it in the growing line, stepping back for a moment to admire their progress before reaching for the next. They no longer looked like frightened trainees trying to avoid punishment. They looked like apprentices practicing something meaningful, turning chaos into harmony. The mess hall grew strangely still. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Officers who had rushed in expecting to see a scolding scene now watched in silence, curious about how the room had shifted. No one had told the cubs to polish each cup, yet here they were, working together with a shared sense of care, their faces lit by the reflection of light bouncing off metal surfaces. The once noisy hall now carried a rhythm, not of shouting or clattering, but of focused effort, the soft scrape of cloth against steel, the gentle tap of cups being placed into perfect alignment. At last, one of the cubs, the smallest of the group, carried a cup that looked duller than the others. He hesitated, frowning as he rubbed it again and again, trying to bring out its shine. The others noticed and quietly joined in, lending their hands, their cloths, and their patience. Together, they polished the stubborn cup until it gleamed nearly as brightly as the rest. When they finally placed it down, they didn't scatter away as they once would have. They straightened their shoulders and stood silently before the neat line they had created. In front of the human, the cups now stood like soldiers on parade, arranged from tallest to smallest, brightest to dullest, each one carrying the mark of their effort. The officer, who had been ready to unleash another reprimand, instead found himself strangely humbled. He realized this was no longer about discipline. This was about respect, respect for the work, respect for order, and perhaps most importantly, respect for the quiet example that had inspired it. What had begun as a demand for tidiness was turning into a ritual, one the cubs seemed eager to continue. And at the heart of it all was not fear of authority, but the steady presence of a human who had shown them that even the smallest act, done with care, could bring dignity to a room. At first, most of the crew thought it was just a passing moment. Cubs were often clumsy, easily distracted, and quick to forget lessons. But this time, something was different. Instead of rushing through chores with nervous hands, they moved with care, polishing each cup until their reflections shone back at them. They placed them in neat lines, tallest to smallest, brightest to dullest, the way the human's single cup had been set. The crew members found themselves pausing mid-meal, forks and spoons held loosely in their hands. They were used to noise, mistakes, and officers barking orders in the mess hall, but now the hall was filled with quiet focus. It was not silence born of fear, but silence born of respect. Every motion from the cubs seemed thoughtful, almost ceremonial, as though they weren't just cleaning cups. They were honoring something. The human technician had not spoken a word since the officer's command. He sat quietly, his cup resting in front of him, polished clean by his own hands. That small act had become the center of attention, though he hadn't intended it. He hadn't raised his voice, demanded order, or scolded anyone. He had only shown a steady patience, and that patience had reshaped the room more than authority ever could. One crew member leaned toward another and whispered, "They're not afraid anymore. Look at them. They're proud of what they're doing." And it was true. The cubs, who usually worked with anxious glances toward the officers, now wore small smiles. They even corrected each other gently, adjusting a cup here, wiping a missed spot there. They didn't rush because rushing no longer mattered. What mattered was doing it right and doing it together. The mess officer, who had been ready to deliver another stern speech, stood in the corner watching with folded arms. He had demanded order, but what he saw went far beyond what he had asked for. This wasn't order through discipline. This was order through choice. The cubs weren't doing it for fear of punishment. They were doing it because they wanted to. And the strange part was, they wanted to because of the human. The human hadn't demanded anything of them, but his calm presence had given them something better than orders, an example. The crew began to see that too. Here was someone who didn't need rank or command to influence others. By the simple act of cleaning his cup with care, he had shown the cubs a lesson that no shouted command could have taught. As the line of shining cups grew, so did a sense of quiet admiration in the hall. What began as a task turned into a ritual of respect. And though the cubs' small ceremony was centered on cups, everyone watching understood that it was not really about metal or polish. It was about the dignity found in small acts, the kind of dignity that only a human's steady patience could inspire. The mess officer had always relied on his voice. He believed order came from command, that discipline was built through sharp words and sharper punishments. Every cub who entered the hall had grown used to his bark, to the way his eyes scanned for mistakes, waiting to strike with scolding remarks. It was the rhythm of their routine, fear keeping hands steady, fear forcing obedience. But that day, as he stood with arms crossed, ready to snap again, he saw something he had never expected. The cubs weren't glancing nervously at him anymore. Their ears didn't twitch in fear, their shoulders didn't stiffen under his watch. Instead, their focus was fixed on the human seated calmly among them. The officer's jaw tightened. At first, he thought it was coincidence, maybe a trick of timing. But then he noticed the pattern. Every movement, every careful placement of a cup, every polished rim gleaming under the lights. It all mirrored the way the human had cleaned his own cup minutes before. He felt the words rise in his throat, the familiar shout demanding better alignment, quicker work, sharper edges. Yet when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. The room didn't need his voice anymore. The cubs were not working from fear, they were working from choice. And worse, no, not worse, he corrected himself, but stranger, they were working with pride. The officer, who had mocked humans more than once for being slow, fragile, or stubborn, now stood silenced by the proof before him. His commands had never achieved this. He had never been able to draw out such focus, such quiet determination. But the human hadn't even tried, and yet the cubs followed him naturally. The realization cut deep. Authority, he thought, was not about shouting the loudest or forcing obedience. True authority came from presence, from example, from something far quieter and stronger than fear. And in that moment he had to admit, though his pride resisted, that the human possessed it. The mess hall seemed to echo with this truth. The officers seated at their tables noticed the same thing, their conversations dropping into silence as they watched. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward with narrowed eyes, but all of them saw what the mess officer now understood. Leadership could not be forced. It had to be earned. The officer lowered his gaze, his once confident stance slipping. He didn't shout. He didn't even move. For the first time in many cycles, the cubs worked without his voice over them, and they worked better than ever. The human, still quiet, hadn't even looked up. In that silence, the officer's mockery crumbled. He realized with unsettling clarity that this was not just about cups or discipline in the hall. This was about something larger, a lesson that he, despite all his rank, had failed to teach. And though he would never admit it aloud, the truth settled heavy in his chest. The cubs had not chosen him as their example. They had chosen the human. From that day forward, the mess hall felt different. It was no longer just a place where trays clattered, food was served, and voices echoed. Something had changed in the way the cubs behaved, and that change began with a single quiet act from a human. The cubs now entered the mess with purpose. Instead of rushing in with careless hands, they slowed down, checking the cups and utensils with care. They would line them in neat rows, largest to smallest, polished until each one caught the light. It wasn't about avoiding punishment anymore. It wasn't about fear of the mess officer's voice. It was about respect. Respect for the order they had learned, and respect for the human who had taught it without ever asking. Other crew members noticed. Soldiers who once laughed at the cubs for fumbling now sat in silence, watching the little ones work. Officers who once barked orders found themselves hesitating, unsure if they even needed to speak. What had begun as a simple copy of the human's movements had turned into something more, a ritual that carried meaning. The mess became a place of small lessons. Cubs would whisper to each other, reminding one another to check the shine on a cup or the line of the spoons. When one made a mistake, the others didn't scold. They corrected it gently, repeating the care they had seen from the human. In their own way, they were building a tradition. Stories began to spread through the ship. They said the cubs didn't just learn order. They learned respect. They learned that discipline didn't need anger, that strength didn't always come from shouting. Instead, they carried forward the memory of the human's patience. The way he had polished his own cup without complaint, without pride, and without expectation of praise. Among the older crew, whispers carried further. Some said this was the human way, that they did not lead by command, but by example. That even in the smallest acts, humans left marks that lasted longer than orders ever could. The cubs became living proof of it, their careful rows of gleaming cups a quiet symbol of something greater. For the human himself, there was no ceremony. He continued his work as usual, sitting quietly in the mess, polishing his own cup when needed. He never pointed to the cubs or claimed their ritual as his doing, but he noticed, and perhaps deep down, he understood the truth. Respect freely given is worth more than respect demanded. In time, the mess officer himself stopped barking commands. He too sat in silence, humbled, watching the cubs maintain a standard he could never enforce. The hall had transformed not by power but by presence, and so the lesson remained. The mess was no longer just about food. It became a place of respect, a daily reminder that humans could teach without raising their voices, and that true leadership came from the smallest, simplest acts.